Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Wofford College. For those of you who don't know, I'm Nate Samhat, president of the college. It's a great pleasure to have you here this evening. It's my honor to introduce this second event in a series of talks focused on African-American history, hosted by the Wofford College Department of History. An evening with Eddie Glaude will begin with a lecture, and if you've heard Dr. Glaude speak, you know you're in for a treat. We just had a delightful time together. Great stories. Following the lecture, Dr. Mark Burns, chairman of the Department of History, will moderate a question and answer session. And afterwards, I invite you to join us for a reception and book signing, which will be right here in the lobby and on the porch of Maine. There will be treats and wine. Always a plus. Especially after the talk, not before the talk. The African-American History series began with Dr. Sylvain Diouf from Brown University Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. On Tuesday, November 16 at 4 p.m., Dr. Glaude Jr, Duke University's Peabody Family Distinguished Professor of History, will present autobiographies of grief, Black women in the Civil War. That event will take place in the college's Olin Theater in the Olin Building. Please make plans to attend that event and be on the lookout for additional speakers throughout the spring term that will reflect the series that the History Department has put together. Tonight, Dr. Glaude will discuss James Baldwin and African-American history, and he's the perfect speaker for us at the perfect time. The History Department quotes James Baldwin on printed materials for potential history majors. Baldwin's work continues to be a powerful reflection of our times, and no one today is better able to talk about Baldwin and his relevance than Dr. Eddie Glaude. Dr. Glaude is a native of Moss Point, Mississippi. He enrolled at Morehouse College at the age of 16 and currently serves on the Morehouse College Board of Trustees. He earned his master's degree in African American Studies at Temple University and a PhD in religion at Princeton University. And today, Dr. Glaude is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton. He makes frequent appearances on NBC's Meet the Press, Morning Joe, contributes to a variety of other MSNBC programs, and writes a column for Time magazine. In his most recent book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Home, is a New York Times bestseller. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eddie S. Glaude to Wofford College and our Spartanburg community.
Thank you, President Senna, for that gracious introduction. It's a delight to be here with you. I want to thank Craig Melvin for making it possible. Craig was like, I want you to go to Wofford. Okay. So I'm here, so it's a delight. I want to thank Mark Burns for his amazing hospitality, his warm spirit. I want to thank the students that I had a chance to meet with earlier. You were brilliant in every way. President Sam, I want to thank your lovely spouse. She's amazing as a host earlier, and all of the people behind the scenes who made our dinner together so wonderful. I'm looking forward to our conversation, so I'll just jump into the talk. Is that okay? Yeah. Whenever you talk about James Baldwin and history, it forces you in some ways to think about the complex relationship between history and public memory. But it's never an abstract consideration. It's always in relation to what is happening in the now. So this talk today will move between a kind of exploration of Baldwin's thinking and a reflection of the troubles that we find ourselves in today as a democratic I want to begin with two quotations. The first is from Toni Morrison, an essay entitled Memory, Creation, and Fiction. If my work is to be functional to the group, to the village, as it were, then it must bear witness and identify that which is useful from the past and that which ought to be discarded. It must make it possible to prepare for the present and live it out. And it must do that by not avoiding problems and contradictions, but by examining them. It should not even attempt to solve social problems, but it certainly should try to clarify. The second epigraph comes from Melville's Moby Dick. But not yet have we solved the incantation of this oneness and learned why it appeals with such power to the soul. And more strange and far more pretentious, why, as we have seen, it is at once the most meaningful symbol of spiritual things, and yet should be, as it is, the intensifying agent in things the most appalling to mankind. I found myself a few months ago, and it was prompted by what I took to be an odd request from Oprah Winfrey's book club, thinking about Alan Locke's 1925 essay, Enter the Negro, a manifesto of sorts for the Harlem Renaissance. The club wanted me to suggest a few books that were central to the period, and of course I mentioned Locke's Anthology, The New Negro, and Jean Toomer's Cain, and Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God, but Locke's essay kept attracting my attention. Not so much because of his powerful declaration of a new phase of Black life, because of his account of a new kind of Black subject with a maturing aesthetic and cultural voice stepping on the scene, or how he describes the material shifts in African-American life unleashed by the mass migration from the rural countryside to cities from south to north, and what all that might mean for American democracy. I was actually more interested in a formulation that actually served as the backdrop of Locke's analysis. What preceded the emergence of the so-called New Negro? What occasioned such a declaration in the first place, and how might we trace its echoes? Locke writes, quote, "The old Negro had long become more of a myth than a man. The old Negro, we must remember, was a creature of moral debate and historical controversy. He has been a stock figure perpetrated as a historical fiction, partly in innocent sentimentalism, partly in deliberate reactionism. So for many generations in the mind of America, the Negro has been more of a formula than a human being. More of a formula than a human being, a something to be argued about, condemned or defended, to be kept down or in his place or helped up, to be worried with or worried over, harassed or patronized, a social boogie or a social burden." End quote. With this view in mind, even Black people, Locke suggested, have come to see themselves, quote, "in the distorted perspective of a social problem." Remember W.E. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk? Quote, "To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word." So Locke commends the New Negro against the backdrop of a host of assumptions about Black people that have shaped how this country treats them and how it imagines itself. Or to put the point more directly, his vision of this new Black subject makes sense only if we are to understand a certain view of white people in this country. How they are valued more than others, how that valuation dictates the distribution of advantage and disadvantage, a view that requires, to use Locke's image, the old Negro. The new Negro, then, is an attempt to break free from the stranglehold of assumptions about Black people that justify a society organized along the lines of what I've called the value gap, that white people ought to be valued more than others. As Locke put it, quote, "The Negro today wishes to be known for what he is, even in his faults and shortcomings, and scorns a craven and precarious survival at the price of seeming to be what he is not. He resents being spoken for as a social ward or minor and to being regarded a chronic patient for the sociological clinic. the sick bed of American democracy. How that sickness plays out in this country varies, of course, but one expression of it involves an intense battle over the threat that the contagion presents to the country, to the culture of this place. Many of the works of the Harlem Renaissance, I'm getting there, don't walk with me now. Many of the works of the Harlem Renaissance remain highly regarded today, but the idea of American democracy, Locke imagined, short of its need for this staid character of black people, or characterization of black people, has yet to come to fruition. We still live in a society where some of us believe that this country must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe, where the stock assumptions about black people continue to circulate. I believe what happened on January 6th was the latest expression of this view, alongside, of course, the ongoing effort to disenfranchise people of color. A mob of mostly white men and women sacked the Capitol in January. They roamed the halls of the Congress and declared that they were here to, quote, stop the steal, to act as patriots on behalf of a country in peril. And what we have witnessed since has involved a torturous negotiation of that event among those who want us quickly to turn the page and those who seem to, at least they say they want to, hold the insurrectionists accountable. No matter. What was revealed and continues to unfold right before our eyes, at least to me, is a clearly different register of civic expression, a different kind of citizenship of those who have the right to dissent and who can claim ownership of the country. And then there is the rest of us. In 1925, Locke asserted, implicitly at least, that the presence of the new Negro challenged the underlying logic of whiteness that threatened to swallow this democracy whole. And here we are in 2021, grappling still with that same serpent. The crisis we face today calls into question a wide range of practices and assumptions about who we are as a country and who can lay claim to the benefits and burdens of citizenship. Movements like Black Lives Matter announce a different attitude, perhaps a different kind of black subject too. And of course, such an announcement takes place against the backdrop of whiteness and the old Negro that gives it life. James Baldwin had it right. The horror is that America changes all the time without ever changing at all. Now, to my mind, any consideration of the stakes of racial justice and the future of American democracy requires that we venture to the heart of the matter. Any consideration of James Baldwin and African-American history requires that we take our attention, that we turn our attention to the heart of the matter. It is an occasion to examine the deep contradictions that shape and continue to shape this country, a contradiction rooted like the tangled knots of an old Mississippi oak, in this idea that white people ought to matter more than others, and the lies we tell ourselves to protect us from the ghastly implications of it all. It is hard for some to admit, but I must say it now, that the American idea is in trouble. In fact, it has been in trouble, in some form of trouble, the moment it was given shape and texture. We tell ourselves that we are an example of democracy achieved and that we are the shining city on the hill, but these stories aim to conceal the contradiction at the heart of this fragile experiment of democracy. James Baldwin put it this way in 1965, quote, "The people who settled the country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw him. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian, and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a country, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. For if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed." And then Baldwin says, "That lie is the basis of our present trouble." We know this country has been and continues to be a place where the value gap affects the distribution of advantage and disadvantage. That we have created a way of life where some are valued and have standing, while others must experience what philosophers describe as a generalized sense of disregard. Our history betrays us repeatedly on this score. We know governmental policy in the post-World War II era gave birth to the vaunted American middle class, and we know that African Americans were systematically locked out of the benefits of those policies. And we also know, although we don't want to admit it, because to do so would be to acknowledge what I'm saying, and to do that would be to admit to the crime, that there is a different form of policing for black people here than for white people. All we have to do is to think back to January 6th and compare how the police responded to that mob and how they responded to the peaceful Black Lives Matter protests. We have too long told ourselves a story that secures our virtue and protects us from our vices. But today, we confront the ugliness of who we are. Millions of Americans feel that the country has turned its back on them, that the browning of America represents decline. And some among them, as I said, attempted to sack the Capitol because they believe the election was stolen. They believe that only white votes matter. Y'all in South Carolina, I'm not telling y'all anything new. Much of this has been fueled by white resentment and white grievance and white fear. January 6th was a moment when the Cold War turned hot. The cold Civil War turned hot, and we heard either that night or the next day, I can't remember, an echo of the past on the Senate floor. Senator Ted Cruz from Texas invoked the presidential election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877 as a framework to settle the dispute around the certification of the election, and he invoked it against the backdrop of an insurrection that left shit on the walls of the People's House. History reveals itself here, not as determination, but as a kind of inheritance. Not as continuity, but as connection and relation, where one event echoes or carries the imprint of another and calls it all into view. Historical facts and personages don't simply appear twice, but in multiple forms and ways, like a blurred image with layers and depth that interrupt, intercede, folds back, and calls forth. All of that is a bit abstract. In short, we've been here before. In those moments of trouble when we've had a chance to imagine America anew, in those moments when the contradiction seized the American heart, when madness grabbed a hold of our minds, we've witnessed over and over again the reassertion of the value gap and the lies that provided cover. Think about the Civil War and radical Reconstruction, what historians refer to as the Second Founding. What did we see in this moment? Well, most historians would say this is the formation of the modern U.S. nation state. The passage of the Civil War amendments gave us our modern conceptions of U.S. citizenship, and so we're untethered from the notion of race. But what did we get in response? We got Jim Crow in the South. Frederick Douglass would live long enough to see the 13th Amendment ratified and witness the state of Tennessee and Mississippi pass the first Jim Crow laws. He would call the men who turned their backs the apostles of forgetfulness. What else did we see? We saw convict leasing, what some call another form of slavery, where the state was deployed to conscript black labor to help build cities like Birmingham. I had to mention that. And of course, the ideology of Anglo-Saxonism. Let's not exceptionalize the South, where the South has to bear the burden of our nation's sins. Where Colonel Murdoch said, if only they would get it right, we would be okay. But the ideology of Anglo-Saxonism informed our imperial ambitions across the globe. At the very moment in which we were consolidating a racial regime in the South, we were annexing the Philippines and Cuba, bringing millions of people of color under our rule. Our only export is not just baseball. You think about James Q. Whitman's disturbing text, Hitler's American Model. There's a reason why he looked to us, not just the South. The same thing happened in the mid-20th century. The Black freedom struggle demanded broad-based inclusion. Historians refer to this period as the Second Reconstruction, an attempt to fulfill the broken promises of the first. And what did we get in response? The election of Richard Nixon twice. Talk about Dr. King being murdered at the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. What what was the response to that bullet that blew the bottom half of his face? We got calls for law and order. We got the tax revolt in California, which laid the foundation for the shredding of the social safety net that we're trying to respond to right now. And eventually the election of Ronald Reagan. And just as a historical fact, Ronald Reagan in Black American, African-American history is as notorious as George Wallace. George Wallace's relation to the civil rights movement, Ronald Reagan's relation to the Black Power movement. It's Ronald Reagan as the governor of California that the late Gil Scott-Heron sings about. Called Big Movie, right? Y'all remember him? It's Ronald Reagan that unleashes the power of the state on the Black Panther Party, that puts Angela Davis on the FBI's most wanted list, an interesting source of praise, to elect Ronald Reagan to make America great again. It's tantamount to a backhand slap to the face. But Reagan was elected, no matter your political orientation. I was describing how he was viewed by many in the Black activist community. But Reagan was elected in 1980, 15 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He was charged to undo it all. To undo the Fair Housing Act of 1968. To undo the Great Society broadly. At every turn, when we have faced the kind of moral reckoning we now face, we have doubled down on our ugliness. At every turn, when a new America is about to be born, the umbilical cord of white supremacy has been wrapped around that baby's neck, choking the life out of it. We have cleaved to this idea of white America and left bodies in the wake. Ours is a moment in which many are running away from history. Or minimally, they think about history in simplistic terms. A recent national poll sponsored by the American Historical Association and Farley Dickinson University revealed that 2/3 of Americans think of history as simply an assemblage of dates, names, and events. A chronicle of sorts, right? No wonder our debates center around what is included and excluded as opposed to the kinds of interpretations of the past that orient us to the present. In that same study, nearly 2/3 of those surveyed agreed that it is acceptable to teach history about the harm done to others, even if such an approach causes learners discomfort. But the widest divisions, especially as a function of political party affiliation, surfaced when people were asked whether history should question or celebrate the nation's past. Most Americans find comfort in myths and fables, illusions that confirm the inherent goodness of this grand experiment. Safety is found in stories that tell us that America is an example of democracy achieved, that ours is the shining city on the hill. As James Baldwin wrote in The Fire Next Time, these stories would have us believe that our ancestors were all freedom-loving heroes, that they were born in the greatest country the world has ever seen, or that Americans are invincible in battle and wise in peace, that Americans have always dealt honorably with Mexicans and Indians and all their neighbors and inferiors, that American men are the world's most direct and virile. Believe that I got a cheap apartment in Brooklyn itself. But there's a different story. A darker reality that haunts this place. It is one drenched in blood and tears, and unimaginable horrors reside there. Trauma passed on from generation to generation, and it is soaked in the soil of this country, especially in the South, where the landscape is often filled with monuments to that violence, bridges where strange fruit dangled, places in the center of town that bear the markings of human sacrifice. When all returns to history, it is not an academic exercise. It is an exploration of the very thing that we refuse to look at. That history contains ghosts that move us about. Ghosts that haunt. The way in which he navigates and in some ways renders In her brilliant novel, Sing Unburied Sin, Jessamine Ward captures the haunting consequences of those who didn't die right because of it all. Those who didn't die right because of our refusal to heed the lessons of our past. Quote, "The branches are full. They are full with ghosts, 2 or 3, all the way up to the top to the feathered leaves. There are women and men and boys and girls, some of them near to babies. They crouch looking at me. Black and brown, and the closest near babies smoke white. None of them reveal their deaths, but I see their eyes, their great black eyes. They perch like birds, but look as people. They speak with their eyes. He raped me and suffocated me until I died. I put my hands up and he shot me 8 times. She locked me in the shed and starved me to death while I listened to my babies playing with her in the yard. They came in my cell in the middle of the night and they hung me. They found I could read and they dragged me out to the barn and gouged my eyes. Before they beat me, still I was sick. And he said I was an abomination. Jesus said, suffer little children, so let her go. And he put me under the water and I couldn't breathe. Eyes blink as the sun blazes and winks below the forest line so that the ghosts catch the color, reflect the red. The sun making scarlet plumage of the clothes they wear, rags and breeches, t-shirts and tignons, fedoras and hoodies. The haunting and terror of history. Echoes of Morrison's rewriting of the middle passage in a different time and different register. History matters because we carry it within us. The history department has that quote from James Baldwin. It comes from an essay entitled "The White Man's Guilt," written in 1965 on the eve, right, of the Watchford Bell. Special issue of Ebony magazine. And what does Baldwin say? He says, in great pain and terror, one begins to assess the history which has placed one where one is and formed one's point of view. Because one enters into battle with that historical creation oneself. This involves confronting the ghosts that haunt our current days. It is difficult for some to imagine the consequence of America's violence and the lives crushed because of it. How the trauma shaped and shapes one's life, the fear from their loved ones, the silence around what happened, the trauma that would then guide how you reared your children, walk the roads of this place, how one even dreamed. Remember that moment in Baldwin's The Fire Next Time when he behaves in such a way that scares his stepfather. As a child, Baldwin is behaving like he's free. And in that moment, Baldwin captures through his mighty pen the fear, because to act that way is to risk one's life. So his stepfather exacts violence, slaps him across the face, almost like Big Mama did with her daughter in A Raisin in the Sun. I'm getting to in the movies. Remember, narrative trauma often fragments, President Sanders, how we remember. We recall what we can and what we desperately need to hold to keep ourselves together. Wounds threaten to rend the soul. Wounds, historical and present, threaten to rend the soul. And if that happens, nothing else matters. So we can't survive. We have to figure out how to remember and to forget. Telling the story of trauma in fits and starts isn't history in any formal sense. It is the way traumatic memory works. Recollection is caught, as Toni Morrison says, in the pitched battle between remembering and forgetting. Some stories, Morrison wrote in Beloved, are not meant to pass on, but we carry them forward in the marrow of our bones. Al Rapato, we just put him in the ground last month. The author of Slave Religion, The Invisible Institution. And Al Rapato was wounded. Why? Because he had to grow up California, and all of the white children jumping out, and then they emptied the pool while he was in it. We try to keep our heads above water and tell ourselves a story that keeps our legs and arms moving below the surface. The cruel irony, though, is that the terrorists move us about. Y'all with me? Just checking on it. I can't see you like I want to. The cruel irony is that the terrorists move us about. We dig trenches to redirect the memories and to get them to flow away from us. But like the waters of the great Mississippi, the memories always return, flooding everything, no matter how high we build the stilts. The past is never dead, William Faulkner wrote in the Direct Window. The past is not even past. We bring this history forward in our daily lives, and if we don't tell the truth about what happened, about what is happening, if we lie to ourselves about what we have done and try to forget or ignore what we have been through, we condemn ourselves to a certain extent to being moved about by the ghosts that haunt. This is the lesson of African American history, the lesson of American history that Baldwin taught me. And I know that politics can't help separating this. I often worry that we are all too willing to trade one fantasy for another, that somehow an election can affirm America's inherent goodness and put a grateful republic back to sleep. Presidential or congressional elections alone, no matter how momentous, do not settle the question of who we take ourselves to be. The answer to that question, and it is a moral as well as a political question, will only emerge in what we do now. Will we finally confront our past and leave behind this idea of white America that Alan Locke referenced? Can we finally give up this idea of whiteness that requires the old Negro? This takes us to the heart of the vexing issue of race and democracy in this country. This takes us to the heart of what we mean when we talk about Baldwin and African American history, because African American history takes us to the heart of American history. A provocation, even. America's original sin was not slavery. To my mind, it wasn't even the genocide of Native peoples. Those are consequences. America's original sin is the belief that white people matter more than others, and that belief, combined with greed, has distorted and disfigured our democratic way of life. We have to tell ourselves a different story about who we are. I'm taxing your patience, but I'm trying to say something. We cannot tell ourselves a story of American virtue that secures our innocence. And here I notice an interesting connection between Locke and Baldwin. Baldwin was only 1 year old when Locke published The New England. Baldwin criticized Richard Wright's novel Native Son because he believed the character Bigger Thomas bore the markings of those assumptions that Locke so brilliantly delineated. Assumptions that had little to do with the actual lives of black people. Assumptions that said more about white people than they revealed about anything else. Baldwin loathed the sentimentality of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and saw Bigger Thomas as the flip side of the same coin. As he put it in the notes of The Native Son, sentimentality is the mask of cruelty. The point is similar to Locke's, that the view of black people in this country, dare I say, in the West, is one bound up with a certain view of white people, that the value gap requires that black folk be considered as a kind of reward, as a kind of victim. Baldwin would go on to say, and down at the cross, and here the conversation is made explicit, quote, and therefore when the country speaks of a new Negro, which it has been doing every hour on the hour for decades, it is not really referring to a change in the Negro, which in any case it is quite incapable of assessing. What it's really doing is only acknowledging a new difficulty in keeping him in his place. Not again. For Baldwin, quote, the country will not change until it re-examines itself and discovers what it really means by freedom. And that will involve, among other things, telling itself the truth, or better, no longer lying to itself about what it has done and what it is doing. But that requires something more of us, a kind of maturity that seems to escape this place like a bunch of damn small children running around. reveal ourselves because we trust ourselves a little. And in this labyrinth, the person is desperately trying not to find out what he really thinks. Therefore, the truth cannot be told, even about one's attitudes. We live by lies, he writes. And not only, for example, about race, but about our very natures. The lie has penetrated our most private moments and the most secret chambers of our hearts. The United States has never been a beacon of virtue. It's not an example of democracy achieved, nor is it the shining city on the hill. But to admit that is not to condemn us to some irredeemable place. In fact, to admit it is the condition for us to grow up. I'm saying this in South Carolina. We tell ourselves these stories in order to protect ourselves from what we've done. Can you imagine what a banished, man, beloved? This historical fiction beyond the fact that she won the Pulitzer and no doubt. But beloved is based on something that really happened. Margaret Garner in January 1856 escaped to slavery. But the Fugitive Slave Law, passed in 1850, allowed her master to try to retrieve her. Once the master found her, always in inverted commas, she had to make a decision whether she would allow her children to return to slavery. So she turned on them. What is considered horrific in Morrison's novel is us. Morrison used to respond to claims that her work was akin to Gabriel Garcia Marquez as magical realism. She would say, no, okay, it's not magical realism. This is real life. Our problems in the United States go beyond who occupies the White House or the latest example of American racism. We have to get to the heart, at the heart of the matter, and this will require us to confront our past and present. Americans are trapped in a history we refuse to know but carry within us. And this is what Baldwin called the root of our unadmitted sorrow. The terrors and panic we experience today have everything to do with the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who deep down we really are. That the nation actively evades confronting this gap, locks the country into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to the American myth as some kind of New World Eden refuse to grow up. And for Baldwin, condemnation to eternal youth is a synonym for corruption. A bunch of lost boys and lost girls we got. In 1962, I'm coming to a close, I promise. I have a preacherly tendency, so I'm not lying this time. In 1962, James Baldwin published in the New York Times Book Review an essay entitled, "As Much Truth as One Can Bear." And there he wrote, quote, "The effort to become a great novelist simply involves attempting to tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more. We must, as Baldwin put it, quote, deal with what words hide and what they reveal. This is all the more important in a country like our own, where our stories obscure the horrors of what we've done and ensure our sense of innocence and inherent goodness. Telling the truth in America, especially in these dark times, requires a certain kind of courage and commitment to shatter national illusions that offer safety, comfort, for the order of things. It involves risking it all in moments like these in order to release us into a new way of being together. And this will entail a withering criticism at times of the past that haunts and constrains. Will you sit in No Chance Saloon? You remember Eugene O'Neill's Ice Red Comfort? Will you just sit in No Chance Saloon, articulating your dreams but never taking your behind off the seat? You step into the world and fundamentally try to change this place. Baldwin insisted that we had to ask the hard question. How shall we put ourselves in touch with reality? Leave behind the sentimentality, bury the view that desperately needs black folk to be the sick men and women of our democracy. He understood the pernicious effects of the lie on America's character, that the lie involved what we tell ourselves about black and white people. We witness over and over again the monstrous consequences of what follows from this view. If we are finally to break loose from it, if we are finally to get out of history's ass pocket, we must describe us to ourselves as we are now. We must do so, to echo Henry James, at the pitch of passion. This is a challenge Americans must take up if American democracy, is to have a future. We have to finally grow up as a nation. The country stands on a knife's edge, and the background conditions that make our democracy possible cracked. Americans have to dare to be otherwise. We have to do everything in our power to break from the old frames that have us trapped in categories and blind us to the humanity of those around us. Reminded of a formulation from one of Baldwin's earliest essays, our passion for categorization, life neatly fitted into pegs, has led to an unforeseen paradoxical distress. Those categories which were meant to define and control the world have boomeranged us into chaos. Max Weber's iron cage had a different register. We have to live into a different way of being together. Our future depends upon it. The rhythm of the country rests right here inside. If we can figure this out, if we can figure out how to imagine being together different. Baldwin said, I trust the South to reimagine the country. I have no faith in the North. That's what he said. It has something to do with the intimacy of our own pain. It has something to do with the soil with which all of us have come into a certain kind of maturity. It has something to do with the past that haunts us every single day. True freedom for all Americans requires that we confront the ghost of our past differently. Tell a different story about how we arrived here. Tell the story, tell the ghosts to go on now and rest. We got this. All of which requires that we work even harder for a better world, for a more robust and vibrant democratic form of life. That we put aside the old fears and terrors and the histories that justify them in order to finally bury that old Negro and the white people who desperately need it. Thank you so much.
I don't want to stop them because they should stop. We've got about 15 minutes. If any have questions, we have microphones in both aisles. If you wish to ask a question, you come down to the aisle and just alternate sides.
You could ask me anything. That doesn't mean I'm going to answer. You could ask me anything.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
So you spoke on how to remember.
Hold it down just for a second so I can hear. I can't hear.
Oh, okay.
Just a second.
So you spoke a little bit on how to remember and forget and the terror of our history. And I'd like to know your thoughts on renaming buildings and whether you think that is beneficial in remembering our past or forgetting our past, or whether you think that is a way to forget our history.
You tried to get me into something. That's a wonderful question. We grappled with this at Princeton over Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, let's put it this way, Princeton is unimaginable without a consideration of Woodrow Wilson. He is the reason why we're considered an elite university in the when they took over Nassau Hall, one of the demands was to remove Woodrow Wilson. And the institution refused initially. But what the institution decided to do was to engage, constitute a commission, and engage in a kind of a real serious and honest reflection on its past and the role of Wilson in its story, in the story that it told. Now the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy is no longer the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy. It's now the School of Public Policy. Wilson College is no longer Wilson College. Right? And they renamed West College Morrison Hall. Now why do I bring this up? Our public space reflects the value gap. You learn race by just navigating the way space is organized. Which street takes you to the black neighborhood in Spartanburg? Say again? Always Martin Luther King. There's a way in which our communities are zoned, such that when you drive, you learn race. So if we're going to fundamentally change, we have to change our built environment. If our institutions are going to shift, see the problem with students of color, I'm going to go on universal, I got you, unless you got to follow me. Many of our students of color, President Senator, approach places like Wofford, or are viewed by places like Wofford and Princeton as latecomers. Oftentimes you're thought of, you should be seen, you should be grateful to be here. So we don't feel a sense of possession of these places. Because as we navigate the space, it's this alienation. Can you imagine eating in a place named after Woodrow Wilson who didn't want you to be there in the first place? If you're paying attention. But there's a reason why Paul Robeson graduated from Rutgers as opposed to Princeton, although Robeson grew up on Witherspoon Street in Princeton, New Jersey. Because Princeton didn't admit black folk. It's the Southern Island in some ways, right? So part of what we have to do is that we have to understand who we are memorializing. How do we make these institutions 21st century institutions? That doesn't mean redacting our past. It means telling the truth about it. Now, there's some hardcore realities. You take that name down, I'm going to take my money. So we're going to have to do something else with it. There's going to have to be some courage here. Right? You have to be courageous. Because what you choose to celebrate reflects what we value. Whenever that stuff happens, I get nervous. So what we choose to celebrate actually reflects what we value. You see? What does it mean that in the South? Not just simply in the South. But you have Confederate monuments all over the place. These are triggers to the public. It's not just heritage. We know when they were built, we know what purpose they were built for, what purpose they were erected for. Right? These are monuments to white supremacy. That's what they are. Now, some people would disagree with you. We can have that argument. But the point is that if we're going to change fundamentally, if we're going to be together differently, that change is not only going to have to be reflected in our hearts, it's going to have to be reflected in the built environment. Highways are monuments to white supremacy. Y'all didn't hear me? You can go to Chicago right now and hear ghosts of communities that were there. Because public policy built through freeways, through those communities in order to bisect communities, to keep black and white separate. The built environment reflects it. So if we're going to become a 21st century institution, the buildings should reflect it too. That doesn't mean we turn our backs on our past, because that's immature. That's like redacting the N-word from Twain or something. That's silly. Why would you do that? We are who we are. You see? You see what I mean? So Wofford can't turn his back on what made it possible, but it has to tell the truth. Right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. One of the beautiful things to witness when Princeton decided, the president didn't tell anybody. We just found out in the newspaper that they removed Wilson's name for everything. The faculty's name.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome to South Carolina. I got a slight little preface to my question or
Sure.
statement I'd like to this. I'm a black woman, raised a young black woman and a young black man. And I've been in positions where I've had to give advice to guidance to leadership to meet young women. Not only that, I am a very, very seasoned social worker, one of those background social workers you use. So you always get the question, why? Why are things as they are? And especially now, I've used a quote from Dr. King to try to give some kind of explanation over the years, and that's that well-known quote, but nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and cognitive stupidity. And I very much find that so relevant now, and I'm just so weary for the way of things now. And my question, or that I'd like to for you to address, or maybe to answer, respond, is how do you feel that quote?
How do you feel?
That quote is relevant to in explanation to the way of things now. Not only as they have been, but we don't embrace then and now.
Would you say the quote out loud again, Fred?
The quote is, nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscious stupidity. How do you feel that relates or gives explanation to the now?
Absolutely. I just taught a wonderful, I'm teaching a course right now, African-American Studies and Philosophy of Race. I taught an essay by Jose Medina, where he talks about epistemic injustice. And one of the features of epistemic injustice is something that he calls racial ignorance. There's a kind of willful ignorance. I used a version of it by quoting Baldwin in Fire Next Time about, the authors of devastation can't also be innocents. It is the innocence that constitutes the crime. Right? And so I think there's a kind of, Baldwin would say, ignorance allied with power is one of the more dangerous features. So I think there is a kind of willful ignorance that allows us to absolve ourselves of the responsibility for the world that we've created. A willful ignorance. So we don't want to tell ourselves the truth. And that's the sign of, if I were to unpack the immaturity, that's it. And see, that quotation from King comes from, this is King who's grappling with the reality of the country that he's been bearing witness to. This is the later King that many people don't want to read. This is the King who's a persona non grata. The King who has become one of the more reviled persons in the United States, making that claim. So it still is relevant today in every way, shape, form, fashion. But Baldwin has this wonderful formulation. King gets assassinated in 1968. Baldwin collapses, tries to commit suicide. He finds himself in Istanbul. A reporter from Ebony magazine attends a party. Baldwin's holding forth. And the reporter asks him about hope. And Jimmy says, and I live by it, he says, hope is invented every day. And I've been thinking about that. If hope is invented every day, that means you have to beat back despair every day. So even in the midst of cascading stupidity, we have to still, find that hope, or as the boys would put it in Other Passing of the Firstborn, it's a hope not hopeless, but unhopeful. called a blues subtotal. Nobody loves me but my mama, but she can be jiving too.
Thank you for coming down here to the gates of hell.
Where's Lindsay? Where's Lindsay? You wouldn't be here.
About No Name in the Street, and it was really interesting to bounce back and forth between your book and No Name in the Street and the Book of Job, and
You got me shouting.
yeah, I haven't finished the book, so I'm kind of like, I have that feeling like I'm about to ask a question and then I'm going to get cussed out by the professor, but I'm not, because I haven't finished reading. So, his memory perishes from the earth, and he has no name in the street. And for years ago, 5 or 10 years ago when I was in college and I read Baldwin, in reference to when he wrote the book, just the fact that he was, or the essays, and just the fact that he was such the definition of a marginalized person, being, who he was. I guess I always thought that it was him that had no name in the street, but it's the white people, right? Okay, all right, thanks.
See, I should have said, wait till you get to the end of it. It's really important. I believe one of the things I'm arguing in the beginning here is that No Name in the Street is one of Baldwin's, if not one of his more important, if not the most important piece of nonfiction writing. And the reason why is because Baldwin sees what's on the horizon. He's writing in what Walt Whitman would call the aftertimes. That moment where you had possibility that's been closed down. The moment in between. It's like, and Whitman uses the phrase aftertimes in Democratic Thesis, where he's trying to figure out what the hell is this country doing, because he sees the rot that is the Gilded Age. Right? So Baldwin has seen the nation turn its back on the promise of the Civil Rights Movement. He knows that these young people who are now crying Black Power are not strangers in the village. We often read Black Power and the Civil Rights Movement as wholly separate events. Many of the young people who were in Black Power were activists, nonviolent activists in the Civil Rights Movement. Stokely Carmichael said he only broke nonviolent discipline once in his life, and that's the March Against Fear. When the police attacked King. So, part of what Baldwin is trying to do in No Name in the Street is to narrate that fragmented history. The book is at the level of form, right? Trauma. How do I tell the story of what has happened, what these folk have done? And it shifts the perspective, right? So it constantly folds back on itself, right? The way in which he deals with them. And he tells you not to trust his thoughts in the book, to trust his memories in the book, right? But at the heart of Baldwin's corpus is a radical inversion. The problem ain't me. The problem's not us. I've never thought of myself as the N-word. Never called myself the N-word. The question is, why did you need it in the first place? Why do you need the N-word? Why do you need the Islamic terrorists? Why do you need the illegal alien? What are these words doing? And so even in the finest time, he inverts it. He takes the Kipling poem, The White Man's Burden. It's the epigraph to one of the essays because he's flipped it. You become our burden. You see? So there's a radical inversion. The problem is not us. And, the cruel joke is that you've made us believe that it is. So we're going to do like Ralph Ellison says, we're going to slip the joke and change the joke. Change the joke and slip the joke. You know what I mean? Right? But anyway. I think we're done. We're done.